Hello, everyone. Before we get started with this episode, I want to urge you to stay tuned all the way to the end. I think you'll want to hear what my guest Weston Brown said at a school board meeting after I interviewed him.
I'm in the top 3% of my class. I'm on track to graduate with a multiplier in my degree and with distinction. And I don't say any of this to sit here and talk about myself or to brag, but I simply want to emphasize to y'all who it is that is upset about this book ban. And it's not just delinquents who want to read smut. It's honor students who want access to the full extent of their education.
This is a 16-year-old student from Granbury High School in Granbury, Texas. She's speaking out against a proposed book ban in her school's library.
I'm not going to sit here and talk about the complete slippery slope that book banning leads to. I'm simply going to say that no government, and public school is an extension of government, has ever banned books and banned information from its public and been remembered in history as the good guys. I also want to question who is making this decision. I count probably, I'm going to say 10 people here, and then one politician and whoever's on this board. That's under 50 people sitting and deciding the information that thousands of students are going to have access to. And those people, like everyone else, like myself included, are going to be subject to prejudice. I don't mean this in a racial way, I don't mean this in a sexual way, I mean it in the purest sense of the word, being that their opinions are going to change what books that they think are and aren't appropriate.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Peternick, and today my guest is Weston Brown, a man who grew up in Texas and now lives in San Diego, California. Welcome, Weston.
Hey, Ken. Thanks for having me.
Unlike most of my other guests, Weston is not an educator. He's not an author or an education policymaker, but this is a story about education. But that part of the story, the part that relates to the books and reading materials students have access to, an issue that is right in the middle of the education culture wars, comes a little bit later. We're going to begin by having Weston tell us about the interesting and rather unique life he had growing up in Dallas, and then what happened after he left home and moved to California. Weston, you were a student, of course, but you didn't attend public schools in Dallas, isn't that right?
Yes, Ken, that's correct. I grew up in the Dallas suburbs, have 8 younger siblings, and in a lot of ways I'd kind of describe my childhood as normal. I have a lot of memories riding my bike through the neighborhood, going for a run, playing with my siblings, going to the park. But kind of where it's different is my parents believed in homeschooling. So from pre-K age all the way through high school, I was fully homeschooled and had maybe 1 or 2 semesters at a homeschool co-op, but everything else was parent taught.
And did you have access to the internet? Did you go to the library? Did you have a big collection of books at home? What was your so-called classroom or your homeschooling classroom like?
Yeah, so it's funny, I kind of look back at it and realize at the time of being homeschooled, I truly enjoyed it very much. Our family had a more flexible schedule. We got to go on trips. But as I've gotten, a little bit older, I look back and see how profoundly lacking it was in many ways, giving me a foundation. We did have access to the internet, but it had many layers of filtering and protection. So it was very, very limited internet access. We owned a television, but it was not connected to cable or satellite. And we would go to the library, but any book that was in our home, whether it was from our local public library or one that we already had in our collection, was very carefully reviewed and had to have a kind of religious context that it was coming from. And some books even had pages removed if they went over things like human anatomy or other topics that my parents felt were off limits were removed from the home. A lot of stories that are very beloved, Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, some of those classics were not allowed. My parents religious persuasion kind of had them in a place that they believed that reading material like that could lead to things like demonic possession or physical sickness or illness or other just negative, kind of undescribed negative happenings in your life by being exposed to material like that. So our reading material was very specially curated and typically ended up being kind of Christian historical fiction was the closest genre that was allowed.
And at the time, it didn't really concern you. You didn't know any different, right?
Exactly. I didn't know. Yeah, you don't know what you don't know, I guess. And so, there were certainly a lot of great memories. I remember of all the things that were banned, for some reason, Narnia was allowed. And I remember going to the library and getting those books and reading them with my mom. And she would animate her voice for the characters and just kind of get lost in that world. And so, yeah, I didn't know any better. I enjoyed it. I remember some occasions of missing out, looking at my cousins or other people that I knew of who were getting to read a series or waiting for the next Harry Potter book to come out. And I felt, on one hand, a little superior. I felt like I was a bit better off because I wasn't reading those bad things. But I also felt like I was missing out.
So then, Weston, fast forward to a time when you were getting old enough to move out, and you did move out, and talk about what that transition was like for you.
So I grew up, was educated through high school, lived at home till I was about 21 years old. Meanwhile, something I'd been keeping to myself that whole time was my sexuality, questions that I had about who I was, and noticing that I was, different than most of what I was allowed to see or experience. And so I had moved out and started dating even and was on my own and kind of gaining my independence in 21, 22 years old. That is kind of when my world and my relationship with my parents shattered, as both of us knew it. Prior to that, we had some disagreements. I stopped going to their home church and in place went to a local mega church. And so there were some differences, but they were the kind of differences that we could reconcile. But I ended up coming out to them in February 2018, and that was kind of when everything changed, and I saw a different side of my parents that I had never seen.
So now you're 24, you've been out of the house 2 or 3 years, and up until that point, the relationship with your parents is pretty strong, but then you decide that you want to share with them the story, your story, and who you are, and something about your sexuality. How did you do that?
Yeah, so it was a conversation I wanted to have in person with them, but the religious beliefs and their reaction, we didn't talk directly about other sexual identities or really about sex at all. It was very much so off limits and something that wasn't talked about past the extent of the importance of abstinence and that you wouldn't, nothing beyond holding hands was to happen until you were at the altar getting married, was their ideal. So these kind of other topics were off limits, but I had decided that it felt pretty volatile and sensitive, and what felt safest to me was to come out via a letter. So I wrote them a letter in February 2018, and one of my best friends was there. We read it together and hit send and just sat in a moment of time stopping for a few minutes, but was quickly followed by one of the most kind of euphoric, freeing, peaceful feelings I've ever felt in my life. Dear Mom and Dad, I'm writing this to share something that I've wanted to share with you, yet have held back for a long time. I believe honesty has incredible value no matter the outcome, which has led me to writing you today. Hurting anyone, especially my family, is the farthest thing in the world that I would want. It is with great relief, clarity, and vulnerability that I share this with you. I am gay. It's something I've known for a long time and ignored, thinking it could change for the sake of others' happiness. I'm happy to say I've arrived at a place of peace and confidence in my heart where I realize of all my shortcomings and flaws, being gay is far from one of them. My heart is full of love for you both, along with each one of my siblings, and I'm filled with many happy memories and gratefulness for the experiences I've had growing up. I realize your heart desires the best for each of us, and that brings me peace no matter the differing perspectives or beliefs we may have. Everything you know about my character, hopes, aspirations, and heart is true. I'm experiencing the brightest, most freeing feelings I ever thought possible. I pray you receive this with an open mind, and I understand this may mean a goodbye for now. I'm here and love you each very much, and through whatever this may bring, my hope is it can mean something beautiful. With much love, Weston. After that, they reacted pretty strongly and kind of on par for what I had expected. They offered for me to quit my job and move back home. They offered to help connect me with Christian counselors. And if you can't see, I'm doing air quotes on my side of the room. Christian counselors that they felt could provide help for me to become fixed. They provided resources and various religious material and said that I was mentally ill, that I was demonically possessed. And they would follow every one of those messages up by saying, we love you, we care about you. So it's really confusing because, no one else said I love you, but then proceeded to say you're mentally unwell or demonically possessed. They also felt a need to protect my younger siblings from me, and so I was not able to now going on 5 years, have not been able to go home for Christmas or Thanksgiving or see my siblings for their birthdays. My parents have been open to keeping communication over a phone call and phone calls and text messages, but stopped all other interaction or visits that may happen unless it was at some sort of public place or event of that nature, but certainly not able to go into their home after that.
Weston, what do you suppose they were afraid of having you come home and interact with your siblings? Were they thinking that somehow you might influence them in a way that they didn't want?
It's a tough question to answer. I don't fully understand, even to this day. It was never a conversation of you need to stop coming over because you're bringing alcohol into the home. You're showing up high. You're belligerent. It was certainly nothing measurable that was unhealthy or damaging. I communicated that to them. I tried to say, I grew up in the environment that you wanted for me, and yet this is still who I am. Don't you see? You can't change someone else. We are who we are. And maybe you can coerce someone into agreeing or influence them in a certain way, but nothing I can do can change my siblings. All I can do is love and support and be there for them. Even if I wanted to change something about them, I can't get them to change anything that's not already in their minds or in their heart. And I think it's kind of maybe this concept of they fear what they are. And in the Christian faith that I grew up with was heavily based on evangelizing and changing other people. And I think that they see that lens of when you're, a Christian doing it, it's a good thing. But if you have a different message, if you're gay, you're evangelizing for that and pushing ideals and changing beliefs that have remained unquestioned. I think it's that they fear that I would do what they do, and that's not the case. And I've tried to share that with them, but that's not something that they've come to terms with yet.
What I'm hearing is that they have a sense that people are very impressionable, and that can work in a positive way if you're trying to convert someone or tell someone about a set of religious beliefs you have, and that you could convince them to embrace what you embrace. But it can also, from their perspective, work very negatively if people are around others or around other material that is contrary to what you believe in. Now, several years have gone by since you shared that letter, and the relationship with your parents is now, for the first time, pretty strained now that they know about your sexuality. You don't have a lot of contact with them, and then somehow you find out about and you see your mother in a video, and your mom is addressing a school board in Dallas.
Apparently, a few months back, my mom and my dad, my siblings had moved from our home in the Dallas area to Granbury, Texas. It's a small Texas town. It's grown quite a bit over the past years, but still kind of that southern small town feel in a lot of ways. And I don't say that as a negative at all. It's a beautiful place. And somehow, over the course of time, my mom began getting more involved in education. She found herself as the director of a small Christian school there, private Christian school. And at some point, that turned into taking more interest in public education. And she started coming against books that were in school libraries and began to say that they contained pornography and other topics that were just obscene and inappropriate for children. There's a video that was her speaking to a school board meeting, and I came across it on Twitter and was kind of shocked to see, oh, this is my mom right here on Twitter.
I think you ought to have people of good moral standards, people in the community that maybe even are voted on. You don't have to have these ultra controversial books in your library. And literally you have thousands of books. So what harm is it to let go of some of them? And that's all I have to say. Thank you, Ms. Brown.
The video had probably 200,000 views or something. And it was a short clip, and she was calling on the Granbury School Board to repent for what they had done, which was providing these books to children, and for them to have less librarians reviewing books and to appoint a local pastor as a representative or spokesperson to have the authority to approve what books should and shouldn't be allowed in school libraries. And as I dug into it a bit more, found the website that listed the books, and while the initial message was these books are inappropriate for children, I found that over 80% of the books had stories or representation for LGBTQ or queer characters, and it felt personal at that point, that this wasn't just about appropriate material for children, but it was specifically silencing the stories of queer people. And then upon further, looking into the books, I found these weren't stories of fantasy or something. They were simply memoirs or stories about another person's experience. And that even in itself was more alarming, to take a religious filter on what stories can be shared and what experiences can be talked about in a public educational system. And from there, I discovered the books, retweeted a few comments, just kind of communicating my shock and frustration that you contrast trying to ban books with queer representation, my mom publicly saying this has nothing to do with LGBTQ issues, and contrast that with me being, effectively cut off from my family for 5 years, was, commenting on that. And then that put me in touch with a reporter from NBC News, and a story came out after that. They kind of shared the topics that we're talking about today, what it was like to grow up in an environment where education and information was limited, that kind of led us to this moment of you and I having a conversation.
The school district or the school was that your mom went to, and when she asked the board members to repent, this wasn't a religious school, this was a public school?
Yes. Public school, Granbury ISD.
So Granbury School District is a public school, and I'm almost thinking that the school board members had erred by having these materials and wanted them to repent. So I'm guessing there are people there that are Christian that attend the district, and there's some that are not. Some may be Muslim, some could be atheist, and but there are probably schools in that city or that are religious that are not public schools. But she and then they can do what they want with their reading materials. But she's asking trustees of a public school district to remove these books because she feels that they're harmful and I guess somehow are not in line with her view of Christianity.
Ken, that's exactly right. And furthermore, I left this out. I forgot, but my mom also, with another local Granbury resident, made allegations or filed charges against librarians, accusing them of distributing pornography to children, which opened an investigative case and also, as you can imagine, created quite a high-pressure, intense situation for the librarians locally. And just kind of thinking about that of a mom who hasn't set foot in a public school in 30 years, has 9 kids, none of them have ever been involved or enrolled in a public school, is now trying to charge librarians with a horrible accusation, ruining people's reputation, taking the small town crowd and making them angry and activated on the basis of something like pornography being distributed to children, and escalating that further by making these accusations, which then kicked off an investigation that is, as far as I know, to this day still pending and in process, but of course has come to nothing from that. And then on my investigation of the books, they're listed on a website. They simply tell people's stories, and there hasn't been a single example of anything that was written with, kind of a erotic intent or for anything other than education or someone telling their story.
Weston, as you probably know, what your mother did is what parents and concerned citizens around the country and some politicians are doing, which is calling attention to something they see as a problem, which is that kids are being exposed to ideas, in this case, ideas that I guess are framed as pornographic by some or just inappropriate. And the concern is that somehow exposure to these ideas, exposure to different gender and sexual identities will influence the people that see and read those things, that will cause them to rethink their identity. I don't want to say choose a different lifestyle, because as you said before, it wasn't a choice on your part. Your being gay wasn't a choice, but just exposure to these things will somehow influence them. I'm just wondering, what would you say to those people who were concerned about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, looking back, I would have never used the word superstition before, but I realized that my family's faith growing up was filled with superstition, that simply seeing a movie that was scary, and I don't even mean a horror film, I mean a Disney movie that had a scary scene, or reading a book that had something scary in it, would alter someone's mental state or change them. Likewise, being exposed to talking about sex, sex education, discussing gender identities, discussing gender roles, any of those things could influence a person. I think to someone who has those concerns, as funny as it may sound, I really appreciate it. I appreciate someone who cares about the well-being of a child. I appreciate someone's intent to ensure that a child is raised in the best environment possible. But I would say to anyone, especially parents of those, or parents of children, or someone who's thinking of starting a family, I would encourage you to recognize that, or understand that children are much more resilient than you think. I think they can handle difficult conversations. And I think it's much better to have a difficult conversation with a child, adolescent, young adult, than to leave them unaware and vulnerable. You know, I knew certain topics were off limits with my family. And so as I gained bits of access to the internet, I was finding completely unfiltered information on the internet at large. And I knew it was unsafe to have these conversations with my parents. So it left me very vulnerable in not understanding basic information about sex, healthy relationships, communication. So for someone who's concerned about the ultimate well-being of their child, I would urge them to, you know, one, listen to librarians, listen to educators, listen to the people who actually work in the space, who are actually with your kids day to day, and listen to people who are researching children's well-being and mental health, and seek out resources to have the difficult conversations, because I know no one wants to picture their kid having a hard conversation, learning about something like sexual assault or learning about some of the darker aspects of the world that we live in. But I would urge parents to recognize and realize that even in these protected environments, even the one I grew up in that was perfectly to my parents' standard, I was still exploring these things in little bits and pieces. I was still having them. Nothing is stopping the conversation from happening. You're either diminishing it or delaying it, but in the process of diminishing and delaying it, you're leaving your children just exceptionally vulnerable. I think a lot of parents talk about the ideals, but I have a voice of someone who grew up in that environment that was extremely limited and managed and curated to their perfect religious tastes. And yet I still came up through this not ever losing my sense of self, knowing who I was, and knowing now, looking back at the younger version of myself, knowing what I needed was a safe adult, someone to talk to, someone to ask these questions. And so I would urge parents, instead of trying to silence books from being, from stories from being told, or books from simply being on the shelves. Another point, these are not required reading. This is not curriculum. This is simply a book on a shelf. That how much better it would be to have a healthy relationship with your child, to build empathy, to build strong communication skills, for you to have this special role that is such a honor to walk your child into these phases of growing up that are difficult, instead of leaving them alone or making them feel that they can't have these conversations with you. So for parents who have that concern, thank you for that. Your kids need it. So much better to have concern than to not have concern. But please recognize that hard conversations are happening all the time. You cannot stop them. But what you can do is equip your child with the tools to communicate, and information that has been reviewed, edited, published in, that's age appropriate for them in these schools. Because you can't make the conversation go away, but you can do something about actually having them.
So Weston, you know what it means to be a Christian, or some version of it, and you've, I'm sure, thought about your own religious points of view, but do you think your advice applies to Christian parents as well as non-Christian parents?
Well, you know, Ken, I typically try to keep my advice to myself or to people who are actually asking for it. I hope that that advice translates. I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe in it. And I do. I believe it applies. You know, I think growing up, it's strange to see my parents support kind of a political movement and a broader ideology that feels to me so antithetical to what I was taught growing up. You know, I learned help those who are suffering. I remember the Lord's Prayer that talked about forgiving debts as we are forgiven debts. You know, we were told that people would know we were disciples of Christ by how we loved others, that was the mark. You know, I was taught to be kind, compassionate, empathetic. I was taught to follow Jesus's footsteps by speaking truth to power, condemning those who are trying to gatekeep spirituality and limit others' access to God. You know, the character of Jesus was someone who supported sex workers and the working class and the marginalized. And that is what I grew. And then you contrast that with some of the beliefs that I see now, and it just doesn't line up. It doesn't line up at all. You know, I grew up in a family that believed you could heal someone through a prayer. And it's funny because now I recognize, obviously, sadly, I cannot do that, but I can vote for accessible healthcare. And as silly as that example may sound, I feel like I'm truer to those beliefs now by trying to help those who are marginalized, by trying to bring healing. Sure, it's not a magical prayer, but it brings it a little closer, and that's all I know. And so I don't know. Very long-winded answer of saying yes, I do. I say that it comes from the chest. It comes from a place of knowing what I believe, and I hope others can find some resonance and truth in those words.
So it's now been maybe 5 years since you sent the letter to your parents telling them that you're gay, and during those 5 years, the relationship has changed pretty dramatically, and there's not been much communication. What would you like to say to your mother and father now about you?
Yeah, that's a powerful question, isn't it? In a way, I have really said all that I have to say. I think, calling back to another letter that I wrote to them, I would just say what I've already said. I wrote this piece in 2019, and I said, my mindset is not to change anyone in my family, but to love, support, and care. It's disheartening that you will not believe me or try to see if a more connected relationship is possible. If something changes for you, I'd be overjoyed to be part of my family, and if not, it will be a loss to grieve for a long time. As you grieve the loss of who you think I was compared to who you think I am, please challenge yourself to ask if you really know me, and if not, what you want to do about that. What I want from life and my values have not changed, and I think a family separated is a tragic thing.
Weston, I wonder, as we come to the close of this really moving conversation, moving for me, and I suspect for our listeners, how would you feel about my reaching out to your mother and your father and to see if they would be willing to just listen to this conversation you've had with me?
I would encourage you to do it. I think a story is more impactful the more sides that are told, and I think it's in my effort to say that these books should belong and that stories should be told. I think it's in the nature of that to give everyone a chance to say their side to it. So I think it's a good idea.
Well, thank you. I think I'll try. We'll see what happens, and maybe your mom and dad would be willing to record a conversation and have it become part of this. I don't know. With your encouragement, I think I'll try. Part of what I'm doing with this podcast, Courageous Conversations About Our Schools, we say on our website, we're turning down the volume to see what happens. And so my goal in speaking with your mom would not be to try and change her point of view. It would be to try to understand what she's doing and to listen to her reflect on what she heard you say about you as a person, you as a gay man, and you as a former student, and now someone who's reflecting on your own education, and now being concerned about what public school students, how they're affected by the kinds of policies that she would like to see adopted in a public school system, and just to allow her to share with me her perspectives. And then that, I think, would be enormously interesting to me. And I think it would be to our listeners. I think it would all give us insight into where people are coming from, and people that I assume deeply love one another, but who aren't talking with each other right now very much.
I agree. I think it'd be very powerful.
Yeah. Well, Weston, I really want to thank you for being part of Courageous Conversations About Our Schools. And thanks for having the courage to share your personal and moving story, and for helping us think about the books and the other materials that students, and in some ways the children of parents, should have access to.
Yeah, so I am very grateful to be a part and appreciate your time, Ken. Thank you.
Well, I sent a message to Monica Brown, Weston's mother, with a link to my interview with her son. And I asked if she'd be willing to share her perspectives with me and our listeners. Monica listened to the interview, and her first words back to me were these. "This could not be sadder," she said. She politely declined my invitation to interview her, but I continued to correspond with her, even though I myself strongly disagreed with the choices she had made along the way and empathized so much with Weston. I also empathized with Monica. I had the sense that this whole story, the estrangement from her son, his estrangement from his siblings, which she had insisted on, was deeply painful to her. In her last message to me, she thanked me for my concern and wrote this: "Hopefully our story isn't over. There's always room for reconciliation." Now I have another update to this story. Sometime after I interviewed Weston, he traveled from his home in San Diego, California, to Granbury, Texas, where he shared his perspectives about book banning with the city's school board members. This is the same board that Weston's mother, Monica, had pleaded with months earlier to remove books from the school's library.
Hello, everyone. My name is Weston Brown. I was born and raised in Texas, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak here tonight. A few months ago, I saw my mom, Monica Brown, standing at this podium calling for the removal of books and asking for the school to follow the guidance of a religious leader to determine what information students can access. From a young age, I was taught to give a voice to people who were disregarded, elevate the marginalized, and love my neighbor. Today, I strive to be the person I needed when I was young, someone who would stand up, speak out, and protect the kid that felt alone. Growing up, we read the Bible cover to cover from the earliest age I can remember. We repetitively read graphic depictions of sex, violence, genocide, sexual assault, and incest. However, topics related to dating, safe sex, drugs, alcohol, or sexual identity were deemed inappropriate or too heavy to discuss. At 15, I was able to access the internet and slowly started piecing together answers to the questions that I had about queerness, gender, and sex. I was profoundly alone on that journey. I knew I didn't fit the blueprint for the life that my parents were grooming me for. I wanted so badly to know that someone like me could find peace, happiness, and love. I would have given anything to read a book with a character that felt the feelings I felt, ask the questions I couldn't ask, and learn the lessons that I needed to learn. It's been nearly 5 years since I came out to my family. I'm not allowed to join in family celebrations or holidays, or be a part of my 8 younger siblings' lives, solely because I'm not straight. I believe my parents' response is due to a lack of education and representation afforded to them during their early years. This left them confused, and their confusion led to fear, and their fear has led to a family brutally torn. I'm here today to implore you to listen to librarians, educators, and students, not those speaking from a religious perspective or at the bidding of a political group. Schools should represent all students, regardless of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, or background. We expect you to lead the way in creating an environment that gives each student their best shot, having the information they need to thrive in and connect with the world around them. If you choose to marginalize difference and remove representation, you will only cause harm. History will remember your decisions and demand accountability. Show the world that Granbury will not succumb to fear, but will shine brightly leading the way for the next generation of Texans. Thank you for listening.